Well, one thing hasn't changed. I still don't remember to unmute my microphone before I start talking. It's good to know that even now I can't remember that. Hello, my lovelies. I hope you're all well. I have missed you all. I know it's been a very, very long time. Just like we never stopped, exactly. This is the first time since the beginning of August that I've had more than one day off. So I decided I'm done with everything. I had Thanksgiving. I'm caught up on laundry and other stuff. I'm gonna stream for a little bit and see how far I can make it through The Lord of the Rings. But first, I hope that you're all doing well. How are you? Because I feel like I've just been in a little cave. Also, you'll have to let me know if the audio levels are okay. And if you want to keep the campfire with the beach, or if you want to switch to the fireplace. Because we have a fireplace, and it is a little chilly, but I don't know if it's chilly enough for you guys to want to do the fireplace. So you'll have to let me know which one you want, campfire or fireplace. I am prepared for all weather. Okay, I'm glad the levels are okay. God, it's been so long I had to wait forever for OBS to update itself. And then it finally occurred to me, like, if I can hear things loudly and my microphone is only on my headphones are only on 20%, I've probably got it turned up too loud. It sounds nice. Okay. Yeah, you missed the fire. Well, now you've got the fire back. Okay, so Harold Spark, and welcome, Harold, to the stream. So, here's your last chance to vote. You want fireplace, or do you want campfire on the beach? Harold says it's fine. He doesn't. Either one works. So. Okay, we'll stick with the fireplace. Yeah, it is getting a bit cool. You must have followed at some point back. Yeah, it's been 4 months since I was able to stream, so yeah. Life got in the way. Hopefully it won't be another 4 months, but never know. So I decided, instead of doing online books and ebooks, I'm going to read one that I actually have a physical copy with that I can hold in my little hands and drop on the keyboard. So if the stream suddenly ends, you know why. But I will do my best not to drop it. It is a heavy book. So, with that, let us begin reading Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. That's right, we're going old school. Going old school, dropping books on the keyboard. In ancient times, the rings of power were crafted by the elven smiths, and Sauron, the Dark Lord, forged the One Ring, filling it with his own power so that he could rule all others. But the One Ring was taken from him, and though he sought it throughout Middle-earth, it remained lost to him. After many ages, it fell by chance into the hands of the hobbit Bilbo Baggins. From his fastness in the dark tower of Mordor, Sauron's power spread far and wide. He gathered all the great rings to him, but always he searched for the one ring that would complete his dominion. On Bilbo's 111st birthday he disappeared, bequeathing to his young cousin Frodo the ruling ring and a perilous quest, to journey across Middle-earth, deep into the shadow of the Dark Lord, and destroy the ring by casting it into the cracks of doom. The Lord of the Rings tells of the great quest undertaken by Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf the Wizard, the hobbits Merry, Pippin, and Sam, Gimli the Dwarf, Legolas the Elf, Boromir of Gondor, and a tall, mysterious stranger called Strider. I'm not sure why I felt the need to read to you the summary on the cover, but there you have it. Okay, I have to move the keyboard so I don't literally hit it. There we go. Prepare before the stream? I would never. But we're good now. Let me actually just let someone know that I am streaming. Okay. Now, on with the actual book. Actually, this is the prologue. We're gonna read it. Prologue 1. Concerning Hobbits. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published, under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him there and back again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return. An adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier books. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand-loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are none the less nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, when large folks whom they did not wish to meet come blundering by. And this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. For they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of their measure. 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say, and in ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bendobrus Took, son of Isengrim II, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for the hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus the only craft little practised among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skilful fingers, and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as a rule good-natured rather than comely. Broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties and in presents, which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain, indeed, that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even dwarfs. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lie far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them, and the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and the great. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed, but the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the Old World, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books, and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear none the less, from these legends, and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stores, and Falahides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stores were broader, heavier in build. Their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Falahides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early, and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in the Wilderlands. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards. And there many of them long dwelt, between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland, before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with the elves than the other hobbits were, and they had more skill in language and song than in handicraft, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell, and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stores. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallowhidish strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. In the westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Duindain, the kings of men that came over the sea out of Westerness. But they were dwindling fast, and the lands of their north kingdom were falling far and wide into waste. There was room and to spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and been forgotten in Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important still endured, though reduced in size. This was at Bree, and in the Chetwood that lay round about, some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Duindain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days, also, they forgot whatever language they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the Westron as it was named, that was current through all the lands of the kings from Arndor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea, from Belfalas to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years. For it was in the 1601st year of the third age that the Fallowhide brothers, Marcho and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the brown river Barandween with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of Stonebows that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning, for the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men and of elves. While there was still a king, they were in name of his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all in the events of the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowsmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men record it. But in that war the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the dark plague, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of dearth were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had been long deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered businesses. And there, in that pleasant corner of the world, they plied their well-ordered business of living. And they heeded less and less the world outside where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians, and of the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no point had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle before this story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory, the Battle of Greenfields, in which Bendoris Took routed an invasion of orcs. Even the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, these were used mostly as trophies, hanging upon hearths or on walls, or gathered into the museum at Micheldelving. The Matham House it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called a Matham. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of that sort. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left this people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were perhaps so unwearyingly fond of good things, not least that because they could, when put to it, do without them, and they could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those that did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, and at need could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark, not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days, it was, as a rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old customs. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old. But suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smeals as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and the low-lying districts in the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tuckboroughs, or in the chief township of the Shire, Micheldelving on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were specially favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and others of that sort. For even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the Marish Down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather, but they were well known to be stores in a large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallowhide had any trace of a beard. Indeed, the folks of the Marish and of Buckland east of the river, which they afterwards occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire up from south away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts beside, was derived from the Dundane, but the hobbits may have learned it direct from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth, for the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at that time at the Grey Havens away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green mound. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Many hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them, and the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually low, long, and comfortable. The oldest kind were, indeed, no more than built imitations of smeals, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turfs, and having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves, or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses and the holes of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as their friendship with the elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of Great Smeals, or the Brandybucks of Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish and reckoned up their relationships with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales tell of. The genealogical tree at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, if they were accurate. They liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions. Hi, Sober. I'm glad you could make it. Part 2. Concerning pipeweed. There is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clay or wood the smoke of the burning leaves of a herb, which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this peculiar custom, or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybuck, later Master of Buckland, and since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in the history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to his Herb Lore of the Shire may be quoted. This, he says, is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages folk in the Shire smoked various herbs, some fouler, some sweeter. But all accounts agree that Tobold Hornblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew the true pipeweed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim II, about the year 1070 of Shire reckoning. The best home-grown still comes from that district, especially the varieties now known as Longbottom Leaf, Old Toby, and Southern Star. How old Toby came by the plant is not recorded, for to his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveller. It is said that in his youth he often went to Bury, though he certainly never went further from the Shire than that. It is thus quite possible that he learned of this plant in Bury, where now at any rate it grows well on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of the pipeweed. They claim, of course, to have done everything before the people of the Shire, whom they refer to as colonists. But in this case their claim is, I think, likely to be true. And certainly it was from Bree that the art of smoking the genuine weed spread in the recent centuries among dwarfs and such other folks, rangers, wizards, or wanderers, as still pass to and fro through that ancient road meeting. The home and centre of the art is thus to be found in the old inn of Bree, the prancing pony, that has been kept by the family of Butterbur from time beyond record. All the same, observations that I have made on my own journey south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to our parts of the world, but came northward from the lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over sea by the men of Westernesse. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is richer and larger than in the north, where it is never found wild, and flourishes only in warm sheltered places like Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet Galenus, and esteem it only for the fragrance of its flowers. From the land it must have been carried up the Greenway, during the long centuries between the coming of Elendil and our own days. But even the Dúnedain of Gondor allow us this credit. Hobbits first put it into pipes. Not even the wizards first thought of that before we did. Though one wizard that I knew took up the art long ago, and became as skillful in it as in all other things that he put his mind to. Part 3 of the Ordering of the Shire. The Shire was divided into 4 quarters. The farthings already referred to, north, south, east, and west, and these again each into a number of folklands which still bore the names of some of the old leading families, although by the time of this history these names were no longer found, only in their proper folklands. Nearly all Tooks still lived in the Tookland, but that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the farthings were the east and west marches, the Buckland and the west march added to the Shire in S.R. 1462. The Shire at this time had hardly any government. Families for the most part managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury, as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king, for they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from the Old Bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot, and captain of the Shire Muster and the Hobbitry in arms, but as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the Thaneship had ceased to be more than a normal dignity. The Took family was still, indeed, accorded a special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in even generations strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured, none the less, of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding to his name, if required, a number, such as Isengrim II, for instance. The only real official in the Shire at this date was the Mayor of Mitchell Delving, or of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the Free Fair on the White Downs at the Lythe, that is, at midsummer. As mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals. But the offices of postmaster and first sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the messenger service and the watch. These were the only shire services, and the messengers were the most numerous and much the busier of the two. By no means all hobbits were lettered, but those who were wrote constantly to all their friends and a selection of their relatives who lived further off than an afternoon's walk. The sheriffs was the name that the hobbit gave to their police, or the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniforms, such things being quite unknown, only a feather in their caps, and they were in practice rather haywards than policemen, more concerned with the strayings of beasts than of people. There were in all the shire only 12 of them, 3 in each farthing, for inside work. A rather larger body varying in need was employed to beat the bounds and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. At the time when this story begins, the bounders, as they were called, had been greatly increased. There were many reports and complaints of strange persons and creatures prowling about the borders or over them, the first sign that all was not quite as it should be, and always had been, except in tales and legends of long ago. Few heeded the sign, and not even Bilbo yet had any notion of what it portended. 60 years had passed since he set out on his memorable journey, and he was old even for hobbits, who reached 100 as often as not. But much evidently still remained of the considerable wealth that he had brought back. How much or how little he revealed to no one, not even to Frodo, his favorite nephew, and he still kept secret the ring that he had found. Hi, Blaze! Good to see you here. How are you? Part 4 of the Finding of the Ring. As is told in The Hobbit, there came one day to Bilbo's door the great wizard, Gandalf the Grey, and 13 dwarfs with him. None other, indeed, than Thorin Oakenshield, descendant of kings, and his 12 companions in exile. With them he set out, to his own lasting astonishment, on a morning of April, it being then the year 1341 Shire reckoning, on a quest of great treasure, the dwarf hordes of the kings under the mountain, beneath Erebor in the dale, far off in the east. Oh, you're playing Among Us? I want to get that game and try it, but I suspect my computer would not do well with it. But I'm glad you guys were having fun playing. Just kill everyone, I think, is the best strategy in that game. Just kill everyone. The quest was successful, and the dragon that guarded the hoard was destroyed. Yet though before all was won, the battle of 5 armies was fought, and Thorin was slain, and many deeds of renown were done, the matter would scarcely have concerned later history, or earned more than a note in the long annals of the Third Age, but for an accident, by the way. The party was assailed by orcs in a high pass of the Misty Mountains as they went towards Wilderland, and so it happened that Bilbo was lost for a while in the black orc mines deep under the mountain, and there, as he groped in vain in the dark, he put his hand on a ring lying on the floor of a tunnel. He put it in his pocket. It seemed then like mere luck. Trying to find his way out, Bilbo went on down to the roots of the mountain until he could go no further. At the bottom of the tunnel lay a cold lake far from the light, and on an island of rock in the water lived Gollum. He was a loathsome little creature. He paddled a small boat with his large flat feet, peering with pale luminous eyes and catching blind fish with his long fingers and eating them raw. He ate any living thing, even orc, if he could catch it and strangle it without a struggle. He possessed a secret treasure that had come to him long ages ago, when he still lived in the light, a ring of gold that made its wearer invisible. It was the one thing he loved, his precious, and he talked to it even when it was not with him, for he kept it hidden safe in a hole on his island, except when he was hunting or spying on the orcs or the mines. Maybe he would have attacked Bilbo at once if the ring had been on him when they met, but it was not, and the hobbit held in his hand an elvish knife which served him as a sword. So to gain time, Gollum challenged Bilbo to the riddle game, saying that if he asked a riddle which Bilbo could not guess, then he would kill him and eat him. But if Bilbo defeated him, then he would do as Bilbo wished. He would lead him to a way out of the tunnels. Since he was lost in the dark without hope, and could neither go on nor back, Bilbo accepted the challenge, and they asked one another many riddles. In the end, Bilbo won the game more by luck, as it seemed, than by wits, for he was stumped at last for a riddle to ask, and cried out as his hand came upon the ring he had picked up and forgotten, "What have I got in my pocket?" This Gollum failed to answer, though he demanded 3 guesses. The authorities, it is true, differ whether this last question was a mere question and not a riddle according to the strict rules of the game. But all agree that, after accepting and trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise. And Bilbo pressed him to keep his word, for the thought came to him that this slimy creature might prove false, even though such promises were held sacred, and of old all but the wickedest things feared to break them. But after ages alone in the dark, Gollum's heart was black, and treachery was in it. He slipped away and returned to his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, not far off in the dark water. There, he thought, lay his ring. He was hungry now, and angry, and once his precious was with him, he would not fear any weapon at all. But the ring was not on the island. He had lost it. It was gone. His screech sent a shiver down Bilbo's back, though he did not yet understand what had happened. But Gollum had at last leaped to a guess, too late. "What has it got in its pockets?" he cried. The light in his eyes was like a green flame as he sped back to murder the hobbit and recover his precious. Just in time Bilbo saw the peril, and he fled blindly up the passage away from the water, and once more he was saved by his luck, for just as he ran he put his hand in his pocket, and the ring slipped quietly on his finger. So it was that Gollum passed him without seeing him, and went to guard the way out, lest the thief should escape. Warily Bilbo followed him as he went along, cursing and talking to himself about his precious, from which talk at last even Bilbo guessed the truth, and hope came to him in the darkness. He himself had found the marvelous ring and a chance of escape from the orcs and from Gollum. At length they came to a halt before an unseen opening that led to the lower gates of the mines on the eastward side of the mountains. There Gollum crouched at bay, smelling and listening, and Bilbo was tempted to slay him with his sword. But pity stayed him, and though he kept the ring, in which his only hope lay, he would not use it to help him kill the wretched creature at a disadvantage. In the end, gathering his courage, he leapt over Gollum in the dark and fled away down the passage, pursued by his enemies' cries of hate and despair. "Thief! Thief! Baggins, we hates it forever!" Now it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them his account was that Gollum had promised to give him a present if he won the game. But when Gollum went to fetch it from his island, he found the treasure was gone, a magic ring which had been given to him long ago on his birthday. Bilbo guessed that this was the very ring that he had found, and as he had won the game, it was already his by right. But being in a tight place, he said nothing about it, and made Gollum show him the way out as a reward instead of a present. This account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seemed never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts. But many copies contain the true account as an alternative, derived no doubt from the notes of Frodo or Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old hobbit himself. Gandalf, however, disbelieved Bilbo's first story as soon as he heard it, and he continued to be very curious about the ring. Eventually he got the true tale out of Bilbo after much questioning, which for a while strained their friendship, but the wizard seemed to think the truth important. Though he did not say so to Bilbo, he also thought it important and disturbing to find that the good hobbit had not told the truth from the first, quite contrary to his habit. The idea of a present was not mere hobbit-like invention, all the time. It was suggested to Bilbo, as he confessed, by Gollum's talk that he overheard, for Gollum did in fact call the ring his birthday present many times. That also Gandalf thought strange and suspicious, but he did not discover the truth in this point for many more years, as will be seen in this book. Of Bilbo's later adventures, little more need to be said here. With the help of the ring, he escaped from the orc guards at the gate and rejoined his companions. He used the ring many times on his quest, chiefly for the help of his friends, but he kept it secret from them as long as he could. After his return to his home, he never spoke of it again to anyone, save Gandalf and Frodo, and no one else in the Shire knew of its existence, or so he believed. Only to Frodo did he show the account of his journey that he was writing. His sword Sting Bilbo hung over his fireplace, and his coat of marvelous mail, the gift of the dwarfs from the dragon hoard, he lent to a museum, to the Mitchell Delving Matham house, in fact. But he kept in a drawer at Bag End the old cloak and hood that he had worn on his travels, and the ring, secured by a fine chain, remained in his pocket. He returned to his home at Bag End on June the 22nd, in his 52nd year, and nothing more notable occurred in the Shire until Mr. Baggins began the preparations for the celebration of his 111th birthday. At this point, this history begins. And now finally, we actually begin reading the book. Book 1, Chapter 1, A Long-Expected Party. I should probably take a drink before I start reading more. Okay, we are somewhat hydrated. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folks might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasures. And if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. "It will have to be paid for," they said. "It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it." But so far trouble had not come, and as Mr. Baggins was generous with his money, most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except, of course, the Saxville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families. But he had no close friends until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these, and Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo as his heir, and brought him to live at Bag End, in the hopes of the Saxville Bagginses were finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September 22nd. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." At that time, Frodo was still in his tweens, as the hobbits called the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33. 12 more years passed. Each year the Bagginses had given very lively combined birthday parties at Bag End, but now it was understood that something quite exceptional was being planned for that autumn. Bilbo was going to be 11-1, 111, a rather curious number, and a very respectable age for a hobbit. The old Took himself had only reached 130. And Frodo was going to be 33, an important number, the date of his coming of age. Tongues began to wag in Hobbiton and Bywater, and rumor of the coming event traveled all over the Shire. The history and character of Mr. Bilbo Baggins became once again the chief topic of conversation, and the older folk suddenly found their reminiscences in welcome demand. No one had a more attentive audience than old Ham Gamgee, commonly known as the Gaffer. He held forth at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, and he spoke with some authority, for he attended the garden at Bag End for 40 years, and had helped old Holman in the same job before that. Now that he was himself growing old and stiff in the joints, the job was mainly carried on by his youngest son, Sam Gamgee. Both father and son were on very friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo. They lived on the hill itself, in number 3 Bagshot Row, just below Bag End. A very nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, as I've always said, the Gaffer declared, with perfect truth, for Bilbo was very polite to him, calling him Mr. Hamfast, and consulting him constantly upon the growing of vegetables. In the matter of roots, especially potatoes, the Gaffer was recognized as the leading authority by all in the neighborhood, including himself. "But what about this Frodo that lives with him?" asked old Noakes of Bywater. "Baggins is his name, but he's more than half a brandy buck, they say. It beats me why any Baggins of Hobbiton should go looking for a wife away there in Buckland, where folks are so queer." "And no wonder they're queer," put in Daddy Two-Foot, the Gaffer's next-door neighbor. "If they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River and right against the old forest, that's a dark, bad place. It half the tales be true." "You're right, Dad," said the Gaffer. "Not that the brandy bucks of Buckland live in the old forest, but they're a queer breed, seemingly. They fool about with boats on that big river, and that isn't natural. Small wonder that trouble came of it, I say. But be that as it may, Mr. Frodo is as nice a young hobbit as you could wish to meet. Very much like Mr. Bilbo, and in more than looks. After all, his father was a Baggins. A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Dongo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him till he was drowned." "Drowned?" said several voices. They had heard this and other darker rumors before, of course, but hobbits have a passion for family history, and they were ready to hear it again. "Well, so they say," said the Gaffer. "You see, Mr. Drongo, he married poor Miss Pramila Brandybuck. She was our Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of the old Took's daughters, and Mr. Drogo was his second cousin. So Mr. Frodo is his first and second cousin, once removed either way, as the saying is, if you follow me. And Mr. Drogo was staying at Brandy Hall with his father-in-law, old Master Gorbadoc, as he often did after his marriage, he being partial to his victuals, and old Gorbadoc keeping a mighty generous table. And he went out boating on the Brandywine River, and he and his wife were drowned, and poor Mr. Frodo only a child and all." "I've heard they went on the water after dinner in the moonlight," said old Noakes, "and it was Drogo's weight that sunk the boat." "And I heard she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after him," said Sandyman, the Hobbiton miller. "You shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandyman," said the Gaffer, who did not much like the miller. "There isn't no call to go talking of pushing and pulling. Boats are quite tricky enough for those that sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble. Anyway, there was this Mr. Frodo left an orphan and stranded, as you might say, among those queer Bucklanders, being brought up anyhow in Brandy Hall. A regular warren by all accounts. Old Master Gorbadoc never had fewer than a couple of 100 relations in the place. Mr. Bilbo never did a kinder deed than when he brought the lad back to live among decent folk. But I reckon it was a nasty shock for those Saxville Bagginses. They thought they were going to get Bag End that time when he went off and was thought to be dead. And then he comes back and orders them off, and he goes on living, and never looking a day older, bless him. And suddenly he produces an heir, and has all the papers made out proper. The Saxville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End now. Or it is to be hoped not. There's a tidy bit of money tucked away up in there, I tell you, said a stranger, a visitor on business from McEldelving in the West Farthing. All the top of your hill is full of tunnels packed with chests of gold and silver. And jewels, by what I've heard. Then you've heard more than I can speak to, answered the gaffer. I know nothing about jewels. Mr. Bilbo is free with his money, and there seems no lack of it, but I know of no tunnel making. I saw Mr. Bilbo when he came back, a matter of 60 years ago, when I was a lad, but not long come prentice to old Holman, him being my dad's cousin. But he had me up at Bag End helping him to keep folks from trampling and trespassing all over the garden while the sale was on. And in the middle of it all, Mr. Bilbo comes up the hill with a pony and some mighty big bags and a couple of chests. I don't doubt they were mostly full of treasure he had picked up in foreign parts, where there be mountains of gold, they say. But there wasn't enough to fill tunnels. But my lad Sam will know more about that. He's in and out of Bag End. Crazy about stories of the old days he is, and he listens to all Mr. Bilbo's tales. Mr. Bilbo has learned him his letters, meaning no harm, mark you, and I hope no harm will come of it. Elves and dragons, I says to him, cabbages and potatoes are better for me and you. Don't go getting mixed up in the business of your betters, or you'll land in trouble too big for you, I says to him. And it might say to others, he added, with a look at the strangers and the miller. But the gaffer did not convince his audience. The legend of Bilbo's wealth was now too firmly fixed in the minds of the younger generation of hobbits. "Ah, but he has likely enough been adding to what he brought at first," argued the miller, voicing common opinion. "He's often away from home, and look at the outlandish folk that visit him. Dwarves coming at night, and that old wandering conjurer Gandalf, and all. You can say what you like, gaffer, but Bag End's a queer place, and its folk are queerer." "And you can say what you like about what you know no more of than you do of boating, Mr. Sandyman," retorted the gaffer, disliking the miller even more than usual. "If that's being queer, then we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts. There's some not far away that wouldn't offer a pint of beer to a friend if they lived in a hole with golden walls. But they do things proper at Bag End. Our Sam says that everyone's going to be invited to the party, and there's going to be presents, mark you. Presents for all, this very month, as is." That very month was September, and as fine as you could ask. A day or two later, a rumor, probably started by the knowledgeable Sam, was spread about that there were going to be fireworks. Fireworks, what is more, such as had not been seen in the Shire for nigh on a century, not indeed since the old Took died. Days passed, and the day grew nearer. An odd-looking wagon laden with odd-looking packages rolled into Hobbiton one evening and toiled up the hill to Bag End. The startled hobbits peered out of lamplit doors to gape at it. It was driven by outlandish folk singing strange songs, dwarves with long beards and deep hoods. A few of them remained at Bag End. At the end of the second week in September, a cart came in through Bywater from the direction of the Brandywine Bridge in broad daylight. An old man was driving it, all alone. He wore a tall pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, and a silver scarf. He had a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. Small hobbit children ran after the cart all through Hobbiton and right up the hill. It had a cargo of fireworks, as they rightly guessed. At Bilbo's front door the old man began to unload. There were great bundles of fireworks of all sorts and shapes, each labeled with a large red G and the elf rune. That was Gandalf's mark, of course, and the old man was Gandalf the Wizard, whose fame in the Shire was due mainly to his skill with fires, smokes, and lights. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folk knew nothing about it. To them he was just one of the attractions at the party, hence the excitement of the hobbit children, "G for grand," they shouted, and the old man smiled. They knew him by sight, though he only appeared in Hobbiton occasionally and never stopped long. But neither they nor any but the oldest of their elders had seen one of his fireworks displays. They now belonged to the legendary past. When the old man, helped by Bilbo and some dwarfs, had finished unloading, Bilbo gave a few pennies away, but not a single squib or cracker was forthcoming, to the disappointment of the onlookers. "Run away now," said Gandalf. "You will get plenty when the time comes." Then he disappeared inside with Bilbo, and the door was shut. The young hobbits stared at the door in vain for a while, and then made off, feeling that the day of the party would never come. Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf were sitting at the open window of a small room looking out west onto the garden. The late afternoon was bright and peaceful. The flowers glowed red and golden, snapdragons and sunflowers and nasturtiums trailing all over the turf walls and peeping in at the round windows. "How bright your garden looks," says Gandalf. "Yes," said Bilbo, "I am very fond indeed of it, and of all the dear old Shire, but I think I need a holiday." "You mean to go on with your plan, then?" "I do. I made up my mind months ago, and I haven't changed it." "Very well. It is no good saying any more. Stick to your plan, your whole plan, mind, and I hope it will turn out for the best for you and for all of us." "I hope so. Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday and have my little joke." "Who will laugh, I wonder?" said Gandalf, shaking his head. "We shall see," said Bilbo. Pops Rocks, hello, and welcome. I'm glad you like the fire. Yeah, I like The Lord of the Rings. I decided to go old school and read a book that I actually have a physical copy of. I need to talk rocks more. I really want to get back into that. But pandemic and all. Anyway, welcome. We shall see how far I get in this book. We should take bets. Will I get too tired to read first? Or will I mash the book on the keyboard and end the stream by mistake? Yes, fire is love. Fire is love. The next day, more carts rolled up the hill, and still more carts. There might have been some grumbling about dealing locally, but that very week orders began to pour out of Bag End for every kind of provision, commodity, or luxury that could be obtained in Hobbiton or Bywater or anywhere in the neighborhood. People became enthusiastic, and they began to tick off the days on the calendar, and they watched eagerly for the postman, hoping for invitations. All right, happy lurking. Sleep well. Before long, the invitations began pouring out, and the Hobbiton post office was blocked, and the Bywater post office was snowed under, and voluntary assistant postmen were called for. There was a constant stream of them going up the hill, carrying hundreds of polite variations on, "Thank you, I shall certainly come." A notice appeared on the gate at Bag End, "No admittance except on party business." Even those who had or pretended to have party business were seldom allowed inside. Bilbo was busy, writing invitations, ticking off answers, packing up presents, and making some private preparations of his own. From the time of Gandalf's arrival, he remained hidden from view. One morning the hobbits woke to find the large field south of Bilbo's front door covered with ropes and poles for tents and pavilions. A special entrance was cut into the bank leading to the road, and wide steps and a large white gate were built there. The 3 hobbit families of Bagshot Row, adjoining the field, were intensely interested and generally envied. Old Gaffer Gamgee stopped even pretending to work in his garden. The tents began to go up. There was a specially large pavilion, so big that the tree that grew in the field was right inside it, and stood proudly near one end at the head of the chief table. Lanterns were hung on all its branches. More promising still, to the hobbit's mind, an enormous open-air kitchen was erected in the north corner of the field. A draught of cooks from every inn and eating-house for miles around arrived to supplement the dwarfs and other odd folks that were quartered at Bag End. Excitement rose to its height. Then the weather clouded over. That was on Wednesday, the eve of the party. Anxiety was intense. Then Thursday, September the 22nd, actually dawned. The sun got up, the clouds vanished, flags were unfurled, and the fun began. Bilbo Baggins called it a party, but it was really a variety of entertainments rolled into one. Practically everybody lived near was invited. A very few were overlooked by accident, but as they turned up all the same, that did not matter. Many people from other parts of the Shire were also asked, and there were even a few from outside the borders. Bilbo met the guests and additions at the new white gate in person. He gave away presents to all and sundry. The latter were those who went out again by a back way and came in again by the gate. Hobbits give presents to other people on their own birthdays. Not very expensive ones, as a rule, and not so lavishly as on this occasion, but it was not a bad system. Actually, in Hobbiton and Bywater, every day in the year it was somebody's birthday, so that every hobbit in those parts had a fair chance of at least one present at least once a week, but they never got tired of them. On this occasion, the presents were unusually good. The hobbit children were so excited that for a while they almost forgot about eating. There were toys the likes of which they had never seen before, all beautiful and some obviously magical. Many of them had indeed been ordered a year before, and had come all the way from the mountain and from Dale, and were of real dwarf make. All right. It looks like we need to take care of some spammers. So let me mark my spot. Oh no. No ripperoni. That is why we can ban people. Oh, that was easy. Now, after we were so rudely interrupted, let me return to our story. Sober, did you just time yourself out? I don't know about y'all. Okay. When every guest had been welcomed and was finally inside the gate, there were songs, dances, music, games, and of course, food and drink. There were 3 official meals, lunch, tea, and dinner or supper. But lunch and tea were marked chiefly by the fact that at those times all the guests were sitting down and eating together. At other times there were merely lots of people eating and drinking, continuously from 11s until 6:30 when the fireworks started. The fireworks were by Gandalf. They were not only brought by him, but designed and made by him, and the special effects, set pieces, and flights of rockets were led off by him. But there was also a generous distribution of squibs, crackers, bacca wrappers, sparklers, torches, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps. They were all superb. The art of Gandalf improved with age. There were rockets like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke. Their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment. Hold on a second, guys. I will be right back. All right, guys, I need to go and get my mother situated for bed and give her medication and her shots. So I am going to take a break for just a couple of minutes. I hope that you will stick around with us, and then I will be back. God, I hope I put a card on the page that I left. I did. I actually marked the spot that I left off on. I'm proud of myself. I'll be back in a little bit.
Hey, just need to tell you something that just can't wait. Hey, maybe you'll ride away or maybe you'll stay. But hey, this old guitar and me been thinking for days how to say that our love don't care too much for the unpaid bills on the bedroom floor. Our love lives on cheap wine and singing songs to a wasted sunrise with you, you. like I'm with you. With you, I feel like I am somebody, somebody, somebody. With you, I feel like I am somebody, somebody, somebody. With you, I feel like I am somebody in control, like I feel in my bones, like I'm somebody, somebody, somebody. With you, I feel like I am. Hey, won't you come with me from New York to LA? Hey, we'll play this song in every city we stay. And hey, maybe we'll stream 1,000,000 times in one day. Be on our way. Hey, 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 hey. Our love don't care too much for the unpaid bills on the bedroom floor. Our love lives on cheap wine and singing songs to a wasted sunrise. With you, with you, I feel like I'm with you, with you, I feel like I'm somebody, 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 somebody in control, like I feel in my bones, like I'm somebody, somebody, somebody. With you, I feel like I am. And so we made it in New York and LA.
All right, my lovelies. Mama is all settled into bed and has all her medications and that, so we are good to go. Now, let me get the book back down. I see the troll stayed away while I was gone, and I'm glad. All right. I believe when last we left, a party was about to begin. Right. All right, where was I? Yep, gotta keep them trolls out of trouble. When every guest had been welcomed and was finally inside the gate, there were songs, dances, music, games, and of course, food and drink. There were 3 official meals: lunch, tea, and dinner or supper. But lunch and tea were marked chiefly by the fact that at those times all the guests were sitting down and eating together. At other times, there were merely lots of people eating and drinking, continuously from 11s until 6:30 when the fireworks started. The fireworks were by Gandalf. They were not only brought by him, but designed and made by him, and the special effects, set pieces, and flights of rockets were let off by him. But there was also a generous distribution of squibs, crackers, bacca-wrappers, sparklers, torches, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps. They were all superb. The art of Gandalf improved with age. There were rockets like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke. Their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down upon the astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into the trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned into eagles, or sailing ships, or a phalanx of flying swans. There was a red thunderstorm and a shower of yellow rain. There was a forest of silver spears that sprang suddenly into the air with a yell like an embattled army, and came down again into the water with a hiss like 100 hot snakes. And there was also one last surprise in honor of Bilbo, and it startled the hobbits exceedingly, as Gandalf intended. The lights went out. A great smoke went up. It shaped itself like a mountain seen in the distance, and began to glow at the summit. It spouted green and scarlet flames. Out flew a red golden dragon. not life-size, but terribly lifelike. Fire came from his jaws. His eyes glared down. There was a roar, and he whizzed 3 times over the heads of the crowd. They all ducked, and many fell flat on their faces. The dragon passed like an express train, turning a somersault, and burst over Bywater with a deafening explosion. "That is the signal for supper," said Bilbo. The pain and alarm vanished at once, and the prostrate hobbits leapt to their feet. There was a splendid supper for everyone. For everyone, that is, except those invited to the special family dinner party. This was held in the great pavilion with the tree. The invitations were limited to 12 dozen, a number also called by the hobbits 1 gross, though the word was not considered proper to use of people, and the guests were selected from all the families to which Bilbo and Frodo were related, with the addition of a few special unrelated friends, such as Gandalf. Many young hobbits were included, and present by parental permission, for hobbits were easygoing with their children in the matter of sitting up late, especially when there was a chance of getting them a free meal. Bringing up young hobbits took a lot of provender. There were many Bagginses and Boffins, and also many Tooks and Brandybucks. There were various Grubbs, relations of Bilbo Baggins' grandmother, and various Chubbs, connections of his Took grandfather, and a selection of Burrowses, Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of these were only very distantly connected with Bilbo, and some of them had hardly ever been in Hobbiton before, as they lived in remote corners of the Shire. The Saxville Bagginses were not forgotten. Otho and his wife Lobelia were present. They disliked Bilbo and detested Frodo, but so magnificent was the invitation card, written in golden ink, that they felt it was impossible to refuse. Besides, their cousin Bilbo had been specializing in food for many years, and his table had a high reputation. All the 144 guests expected a pleasant feast, though they rather dreaded the after-dinner speech of their host, an inevitable item. He was liable to drag in bits of what he called poetry, and sometimes, after a glass or two, would allude to the absurd adventure of his mysterious journey. The guests were not disappointed. They had a very pleasant feast, in fact, an engrossing entertainment, rich, abundant, varied, and prolonged. The purchase of provisions fell almost to nothing throughout the district in the ensuing weeks, but as Bilbo's catering had depleted the stocks of most stores, cellars, and warehouses for miles around, that did not matter much. After the feast, more or less, came the speech. Most of the company were, however, now in a more tolerant mood at that delightful stage which they called filling up the corners. They were sipping their favorite drinks and nibbling at their favorite dainties, and their fears were forgotten. They were prepared to listen to anything and to cheer at every full stop. "Ribsh, hello! How are you? It's good to see you here. Hope that you're doing well. I've missed you." "My dear people," began Bilbo, rising in his place. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, and kept on repeating it in chorus, seeming reluctant to follow their own advice. Bilbo left his place and went and stood on a chair under the illuminated tree. The light of the lanterns fell on his beaming face. The golden buttons shone on his embroidered silk waistcoat. They could all see him standing, waving one hand in the air, the other was in his trouser pocket. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," he began again, "and my dear Tooks and Brandybucks and Grubbs and Chubbs and Burrowses and Hornblowers and Bolgers and Bracegirdles, Goodbodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots." "Proudfeet," shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. His name, of course, was Proudfoot, and well merited. His feet were large, exceptionally furry, and both were on the table. "Proudfoots," repeated Bilbo, "and also my good Saxville Bagginses that I welcome back at last to Bag End. Today is my 111th birthday. I am 111 today. Hooray, hooray, many happy returns," they shouted, and they hammered joyously on the tables. Bilbo was doing splendidly. This was the sort of stuff they liked, short and obvious. I hope you are all enjoying yourself as much as I am. Deafening cheers. Cries of yes and no. Noises of trumpets and horns, pipes and flutes and other musical instruments. There were, as has been said, many young hobbits present. Hundreds of musical crackers had been pulled. Most of them bore the mark Dale on them, which did not convey much to most of the hobbits, but they all agreed they were marvelous crackers. They contained instruments, small but of perfect make and enchanting tones. Indeed, in one corner some of the young Tooks and Brandybucks, supposing Uncle Bilbo to have finished, since he had plainly said all that was necessary, now got up an impromptu orchestra and began a merry dance tune. Master Everard Took and Miss Melliot Brandybuck got on a table and with bells in their hands began to dance the Springle Ring, a pretty dance, but rather vigorous. But Bilbo had not finished. Seizing a horn from a youngster nearby, he blew 3 loud hoots. The noise subsided. "I shall not keep you long," he cried. Cheers from all the assembly. "I have called you all together for a purpose." Some cheers from all the assembly. "I have called you together for a purpose." Something in the way that he said this made an impression. There was almost silence, and 1 or 2 of the Tooks pricked up their ears. Indeed, for 3 purposes. First of all, to tell you that I am immensely fond of you all, and that 11 years is too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits. Tremendous outburst of approval. "I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve." This was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, but most of them were trying to work it out and see if it came as a compliment. Secondly, to celebrate my birthday. Cheers again. I should say our birthday, for it is, of course, also the birthday of my heir and nephew, Frodo. He comes of age into his inheritance today. Some perfunctory clapping by the elders, and some loud shouts of "Frodo, Frodo, jolly old Frodo," from his juniors. The Saxville Bagginses scowled and wondered what was meant by coming into his inheritance. Together we score 144. Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable goal. 1 gross, if I may use the expression. No cheers. This was ridiculous. Many of his guests, and especially the Saxville Bagginses, were insulted, feeling sure they had only been asked to fill up the required number, like goods in a package. 1 gross indeed. Vulgar expression. It is also, if I may be allowed to refer to ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Eggsgoroth on the Long Lake, though the fact that it was my birthday slipped my memory on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays did not seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however, though I had a bad cold at the time, I remember, and could only say thank you very much. I now repeat it more correctly. Thank you very much for coming to my little party. Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now imminent, and they were getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink his health? But Bilbo did not sing or recite. He paused for a moment. Thirdly and finally, he said, I wish to make an announcement. He spoke this last word so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. I regret to announce that, though, as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you. This is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye. He stepped down and vanished. There was a blinding flash of light, and the guests all blinked. When they opened their eyes, Bilbo was nowhere to be seen. 144 flabbergasted hobbits sat back speechless. Old Odo Proudfoot removed his feet from the table and stamped. Then there was dead silence, until suddenly, after several deep breaths, every Baggins, Boffin, Took, Brandybuck, Grub, Chub, Burrows, Bulger, Bracegirdle, Brockhouse, Goodbody, Hornblower, and Proudfoot began to talk at once. It was generally agreed that the joke was in very bad taste, and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of shock and annoyance. "He's mad, I always said so," was probably the most popular comment. Even the Tooks, with a few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. For the moment, most of them took it for granted that his disappearance was nothing more than a ridiculous prank. But old Rory Brandybuck was not so sure. Neither age nor an enormous dinner had clouded his wits, and he said to his daughter-in-law, Esmeralda, "There's something fishy in this, my dear. I believe that mad Baggins is off again. Silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him." He called loudly to Frodo to send the wine round again. Frodo was the only one present who said nothing. For some time he had sat silent beside Bilbo's empty chair and ignored all remarks and questions. He had enjoyed the joke, of course, even though he had been in the know. He had difficulty in keeping from laughter at the indignant surprise of the guests. But at the same time he felt deeply troubled. He realized suddenly that he loved the old hobbit dearly. Most of the guests went on eating and drinking and discussing Bilbo Baggins' oddities, past and present. But the Saxville Bagginses had already departed in wrath. Frodo did not want to have any more to do with the party. He gave orders for more wine to be served. Then he got up and drained his own glass silently to the health of Bilbo and slipped out of the pavilion. As for Bilbo Baggins, even while he was making his speech, he had been fingering the golden ring in his pocket, his magic ring that he had kept secret for so many years. As he stepped down, he slipped it on his finger, and was never seen by any hobbit in Hobbiton again. He walked briskly back to his hole, and stood for a moment listening with a smile to the din in the pavilion and to the sounds of merrymaking in other parts of the field. Then he went in. He took off his party clothes, folded up and wrapped in tissue paper his embroidered silk waistcoat, and put it away. Then he put on quickly some old untidy garments, and fastened round his waist a worn leather belt. On it he hung a short sword in a battered black leather scabbard. From a locked drawer, smelling of mothballs, he took out an old cloak and hood. They had been locked up as if they were very precious, but they were so patched and weather-stained that their original color could hardly be guessed. It might have been dark green. They were rather too large for him. He then went into his study, and from a large strong box took out a large, bulky envelope. The book and bundle he stuffed into the top of a heavy bag that was standing there, already nearly full. Into the envelope he slipped his golden ring and its fine chain, and then sealed it and addressed it to Frodo. At first he put it on the mantelpiece, but suddenly he removed it and stuck it in his pocket. At that moment the door opened, and Gandalf came quickly in. "Hello," said Bilbo. "I wondered if you would turn up." "I am glad to find you visible," replied the wizard, sitting down in a chair. "I wanted to catch you and have a few final words. I suppose you feel that everything has gone off splendidly and according to plan." "Yes, I do," said Bilbo. "Though that flash was surprising. It quite startled me, let alone the others. A little addition of your own, I suppose." "It was. You have wisely kept that ring secret all these years, and it seemed to me necessary to give your guests something else that would seem to explain your sudden vanishment. And would spoil my joke. You are an interfering old busybody," laughed Bilbo. "But I expect you know best, as usual." "I do, when I know anything. But I don't feel too sure about this whole affair. It has now come to the final point. You have had your joke, and alarmed or offended most of your relations, and given the whole Shire something to talk about for 9 days, or 99 more likely. Are you going any further?" "Yes, I am. I feel I need a holiday. A very long holiday, as I have told you before. Probably a permanent holiday. I don't expect I shall return. In fact, I don't mean to, and I have made all arrangements. I am old, Gandalf. I don't look it, but I am beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts. Well preserved indeed, he snorted. Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a change or something. Gandalf looked curiously and closely at him. No, it does not seem right, he said thoughtfully. No, after all, I believe your plan is probably the best. Well, I've made up my mind anyway. I want to see mountains again, Gandalf. Mountains. And then find somewhere where I can rest. In peace and quiet, without a lot of relatives prying around and a string of confounded visitors hanging on the bell. I might find somewhere where I can finish my book. I have thought of a nice ending for it. And he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. Gandalf laughed. I hope he will. But nobody will read the book, however it ends. Oh, they may in years to come. Frodo has read some already, as far as it has gone. You'll keep an eye on Frodo, won't you? Yes, I will. 2 eyes, as often as I can spare them. He would come with me, of course, if I asked him. In fact, he offered to once, just before the party. But he does not really want to, yet. I want to see the wild country again before I die, and the mountains, but he is still in love with the Shire, with woods and fields and little rivers. He ought to be comfortable here. I'm leaving everything to him, of course, except a few oddments. I hope he will be happy when he gets used to being on his own. It's time he was his own master now. Everything? Said Gandalf. The ring as well. You agreed to that, you remember. Well, yes, I suppose so, stammered Bilbo. Where is it? In an envelope, if you must know, said Bilbo impatiently. There on the mantelpiece. Well, no, here it is in my pocket. He hesitated. Isn't that odd now? He said softly to himself. Yet after all, why not? Why shouldn't it stay there? Gandalf looked again very hard at Bilbo, and there was a gleam in his eyes. I think, Bilbo, he said quietly, I should leave it behind. Don't you want to? Well, yes, and no. Now it comes to it, I don't like parting with it at all. I may say, and I don't really see why I should. Why do you want me to? He asked, and a curious change came over his voice. It was sharp with suspicion and annoyance. You are always badgering me about my ring, but you have never bothered me about the other things that I got on my journey. No, but I had to badger you, said Gandalf. I wanted the truth. It was important. Magic rings are, well, magical, and they are rare and curious. I was professionally interested in your ring, you may say, and I still am. I should like to know where it is, if you go wandering again. Also, I think you have had it quite long enough. You don't need it any more, Bilbo, unless I am quite mistaken. Bilbo flushed, and there was an angry light in his eyes. His kindly face grew hard. Why not? He cried. And what business is it of yours, anyway, to know what I do with my own things? It is my own. I found it. It came to me. Yes, yes, said Gandalf, but there is no need to get angry. If I am, it is your fault, said Bilbo. It is mine, I tell you. My own. My precious. Yes, my precious. The wizard's face remained grave and attentive, and only a flicker in his deep eyes showed that he was startled and indeed alarmed. It has been called that before, he said, but not by you. But I say it now, and why not? Even if Gollum said the same once, it's not his now, but mine, and I shall keep it, I say. Gandalf stood up. He spoke sternly. "You will be a fool if you do it, Bilbo," he said. "You make that clearer with every word you say. It has got far too much hold on you. Let it go, and then you can go yourself and be free." "I'll do as I choose and go as I please," said Bilbo obstinately. Now, my dear hobbit," said Gandalf. "All your long life we've been friends, and you owe me something. Come, do as we promised. Give it up." "Well, if you want my ring yourself, say so," cried Bilbo. "But you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you." His hand strayed to the hilt of his small sword. Gandalf's eyes flashed. "Then it will be my turn to get angry soon," he said. "If you say that again, I shall. Then you will see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked." He took a step toward the hobbit, and he seemed to grow tall and menacing. His shadow filled the little room. Bilbo backed away to the wall, breathing hard, his hand clutching at his pocket. They stood for a while facing one another, and the air of the room tingled. Gandalf's eyes remained bent on the hobbit. Slowly his hands relaxed, and he began to tremble. "I don't know what has come over you, Gandalf," he said. "You've never been like this before. What is it all about? It is mine, isn't it? I found it, and Gollum would have killed me if I hadn't kept it. I'm not a thief, whatever he said." Yeah, I started to venture off into a different story than the one we're actually reading. Don't get me wrong, Gandalf the Gay could be a fascinating character too. "I have never called you one," Gandalf answered. "And I'm not one either. I'm not trying to rob you, but to help you. I wish you would trust me as you used." He turned away, and the shadow passed. He seemed to dwindle again to an old gray man, bent and troubled. Bilbo drew his hand over his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I felt so queer. And yet it would be a relief, in a way, not to be bothered with it anymore. It has been so growing on my mind lately. Sometimes I have felt it was like an eye looking at me. And I am always wanting to put it on and disappear, don't you know? Or wondering if it's safe, and pulling it out to make sure. I tried locking it up, but I found I couldn't rest without it in my pocket. I don't know why. And I don't seem able to make up my mind." "Then trust me," said Gandalf. "It is quite made up. Go away and leave it behind. Stop possessing it. Give it to Frodo, and I will look after him." Bilbo stood for a moment tense and undecided. Presently he sighed. "All right," he said with an effort. "I will." Then he shrugged his shoulders and smiled rather ruefully. "After all, that's what this party business was all about, really. To give away lots of birthday presents, and somehow make it easier to give it away at the same time. It hasn't made it any easier in the end, but it would be a pity to waste all my preparations. It would quite spoil the joke. Indeed, it would take away the only point I ever saw in the affair," said Gandalf. "Very well," said Bilbo. "It goes to Frodo with all the rest." He drew a deep breath. "And now I really must be starting, or somebody else will catch me. I've said goodbye, and I couldn't bear to do it all over again." He picked up his bag and moved to the door. "You've still got the ring in your pocket," said the wizard. "Well, so I have," cried Bilbo. "And my will and all the other documents, too. You had better take it and deliver it for me. That will be safest." "No, don't give the ring to me," said Gandalf. "Put it on the mantelpiece. It will be safe enough there till Frodo comes. I shall wait for him." Bilbo took out the envelope, but just as he was about to set it by the clock, his hand jerked back, and the packet fell on the floor. Before he could pick it up, the wizard stooped and seized it and set it in its place. A spasm of anger passed swiftly over the hobbit's face again. Suddenly it gave way to a look of relief and a laugh. "Well, that's that," he said. "Now I'm off." They went out into the hall. Bilbo chose his favorite stick from the stand. Then he whistled. 3 dwarves came out of different rooms where they had been busy. "Is everything ready?" asked Bilbo. "Everything packed and labeled." "Everything," they answered. "Well, let's start then." He stepped out the front door. It was a fine night, and the black sky was dotted with stars. He looked up, sniffing the air. What fun! What fun to be off again, off on the road with dwarves. This is what I have really been longing for years. "Goodbye," he said, looking at his old home and bowing to the door. "Goodbye, Gandalf." "Goodbye for the present, Bilbo. Take care of yourself. You are old enough, and perhaps wise enough. Take care. I don't care. Don't you worry about me. I am as happy now as I have ever been, and that is saying a great deal. But the time has come. I am being swept off my feet at last," he added. And then in a low voice, as if to himself, he sang softly in the dark. "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can. And I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet. And whither then, I cannot say." He paused, silent for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned away from the lights and voices in the fields and tents, and followed by his 3 companions, went round into his garden, and trotted down the long sloping path. He jumped over a low place in the hedge at the bottom, and took to the meadows, passing into the night like a rustle of wind in the grass. Gandalf remained for a while, staring after him into the darkness. "Goodbye, my dear Bilbo. Until our next meeting," he said softly, and went back indoors. Frodo came in soon afterwards, and found him sitting in the dark, deep in thought. "Has he gone?" he asked. "Yes," answered Gandalf. "He has gone at last." Hello, Rinstro. That is a nice verse, isn't it? I hoped until this evening that it was only a joke," said Frodo. "But I knew in my heart that he really meant to go. He always used to joke about serious things. I wish I had come back sooner, just to see him off." "I think really he preferred slipping off quietly in the end," said Gandalf. "Don't be too troubled. He's all right. Now, he left a packet for you. There it is." Frodo took the envelope from the mantelpiece and glanced at it, but did not open it. "You'll find his will and all the other documents in there, I think," said the wizard. "You are the master of Bag End now, and also, I fancy, you'll find a golden ring." "The ring!" exclaimed Frodo. "Has he left me that? I wonder why. Still, it may be useful." "It may, and it may not," said Gandalf. "I should not make use of it if I were you, but keep it secret and keep it safe. Now I am going to bed." As master of Bag End, Frodo felt it his painful duty to say goodbye to the guests. Rumors of strange events had by now spread all over the field, but Frodo would only say, "No doubt everything will be cleared up in the morning." About midnight carriages came for the important folks. One by one they rolled away, filled with full but very unsatisfied hobbits. Gardeners came by arrangement, and removed in wheelbarrows those that had inadvertently remained behind. Night slowly passed. The sun rose. The hobbits rose rather later. Morning went on. People came and began by order to clear away the pavilions and the tables and the chairs, and the spoons and knives and bottles and plates, and the lanterns and the flowering shrub in boxes, and the crumbs and cracker paper, the forgotten bags and gloves and handkerchiefs, and the uneaten food, a very small item. Then a number of other people came without order, Bagginses and Boffins and Bolgers and Tooks and other guests that lived or were staying near. By midday, when even the best fed were out and about again, there was a large crowd at Bag End, uninvited but not unexpected. Frodo was waiting on the step, smiling, but looked rather tired and worried. He welcomed all the callers, but he had not much more to say than before. His reply to all inquiries was simply this: Mr. Bilbo Baggins has gone away, as far as I know, for good. Some of the visitors he invited to come inside, as Bilbo had left messages for them. Inside in the hall there was piled a large assortment of packages and parcels and small articles of furniture. On every item there was a label tied. There were several labels of this sort. For Adelard took, for his very own, from Bilbo, on an umbrella. Adelard had carried off many unlabeled ones. For Dora Baggins, in memory of a long correspondence with love from Bilbo, on a large waste-paper basket. Dora was Drogo's sister and the eldest surviving female relative of Bilbo and Frodo. She was 99 and had written reams of good advice for more than half a century. For Milo Burrows, hoping it will be useful, from BB, on a gold pen and ink bottle. Milo never answered letters. For Angelica's use from Uncle Bilbo, on a round convex mirror. She was a young Baggins, and too obviously considered her face shapely. For the collection of Hugo Bracegirdle, from a contributor, on an empty bookcase. Hugo was a great borrower of books, and worse than usual at returning them. For Lobelia Saxville Baggins, as a present, on a case of silver spoons. Bilbo believed that she had acquired a good many of his spoons while he was away on his former journey. Lobelia knew that quite well. When she arrived later in the day, she took the point at once, but she also took the spoons. This is only a small selection of the assembled presents. Bilbo's residence had got rather cluttered up with things in the course of his long life. It was a tendency of hobbit holes to get cluttered up, for which the custom of giving so many birthday presents was largely responsible. Not, of course, that the birthday presents were always new. There were one or two old mathams of forgotten use that had circulated all around the district. But Bilbo had usually given new presents, and kept those that he received. The old hole was now being cleared a little. Every one of the various parting gifts had labels, written out personally by Bilbo, and several had some point or some joke. But of course most of the things were given where they would be wanted and welcome. The poorer hobbits, and especially those of Bagshot Row, did very well. Old Gaffer Gamgee got 2 sacks of potatoes, a new spade, a woolen waistcoat, and a bottle of ointment for creaking joints. Old Rory Brandybuck, in return for much hospitality, got a dozen bottles of old Wynyards, a strong red wine from the South Farthing, and now quite mature, as it had been laid down by Bilbo's father. Rory quite forgave Bilbo, and voted him a capital fellow after the first bottle. There was plenty of everything left for Frodo, and of course all the chief treasures, as well as the books, pictures, and more than enough furniture, were left in his possession. There was, however, no sign nor mention of money or jewelry. Not a penny piece or a glass bead was given away. Frodo had a very trying time that afternoon. A false rumor that the whole household was being distributed free spread like wildfire, and before long the place was packed with people who had no business there, but could not be kept out. Labels got torn off and mixed, and quarrels broke out. Some people tried to do swaps and deals in the halls, and others tried to make out with minor items not addressed to them, or with anything that seemed unwanted or unwatched. The road to the gate was blocked with barrows and handcarts. In the middle of the commotion, the Saxville Bagginses arrived. Frodo had retired for a while, and left his friend Merry Brandybuck to keep an eye on things. When Otho loudly demanded to see Frodo, Merry bowed politely. I blame everything on Lobelia. It's obviously her fault. He is indisposed, he said. He is resting. Hiding, you mean, said Lobelia. Anyway, we want to see him, and we mean to see him. Just go and tell him so. Merry left them a long while in the hall, and they had time to discover their parting gift of spoons. It did not improve their tempers. Eventually they were shown into the study. Frodo was sitting at a table with a lot of papers in front of him. He looked indisposed, to see Saxville Bagginses at any rate, and he stood up, fidgeting with something in his pocket, but he spoke quite politely. The Saxville Bagginses were rather offensive. They began by offering him bad bargain prices, as between friends, for various valuable and unlabeled things. When Frodo replied that only the things specially directed by Bilbo were being given away, they said the whole affair was very fishy. Only one thing is clear to me, said Otho, and that is that you were doing exceedingly well out of it. I insist on seeing the will. Otho would have been Bilbo's heir, but for the adoption of Frodo. He read the will carefully and snorted. It was unfortunately very clear and correct, according to the legal customs of hobbits, which demand, among other things, 7 signatures of witnesses in red ink. Foiled again, he said to his wife. And after waiting 60 years, spoons? Fiddlesticks. He snapped his fingers under Frodo's nose and stumped off. But Lobelia was not so easy got rid of. A little later, Frodo came out of the study to see how things were going and found her still about the place, investigating nooks and corners and tapping the floors. He escorted her firmly off the premises after he had relieved her of several small but rather valuable articles that had somehow fallen inside her umbrella. Her face looked as if she was in the throes of thinking out a really crushing parting remark, but all she found to say, turning round on the step, was, "You'll live to regret it, young fellow. Why didn't you go too? You don't belong here. You're no Baggins. You're a brandy-buck." "Did you hear that, Mary? That was an insult, if you like," said Frodo, as he shut the door on her. "It was a compliment," said Mary Brandybuck, "and so, of course, not true." Then they went round the hole and evicted 3 young hobbits, 2 boffins and a bolger, who were knocking holes in the walls of one of the cellars. Frodo also had a tussle with young Sancho Proudfoot, old Odo Proudfoot's grandson, who had begun an excavation in the larger pantry where he thought there was an echo. The legend of Bilbo's gold excited both curiosity and hope, for legendary gold, mysteriously obtained, if not positively ill-gotten, is, as everyone knows, anyone's for the finding, unless the search is interrupted. When he had overcome Sancho and pushed him out, Frodo collapsed on a chair in the hall. "It's time to close the shop, Mary," he said. "Lock the door and don't open it to anyone today, not even if they bring a battering ram." Then he went to relieve himself with a belated cup of tea. He had hardly sat down when there came a soft knock at the front door. Lobelia again, most likely, he thought. She must have thought of something really nasty and have come back to say it. It can wait. He went on with his tea. The knock was repeated, much louder, but he took no notice. Suddenly the wizard's head appeared at the window. "If you don't let me in, Frodo, I shall blow your door right down your hole and out through the hill," he said. "My dear Gandalf, half a minute," cried Frodo, running out the room to the door. Come in, come in. I thought it was Lobelia." "Then I forgive you. But I saw her some time ago, driving a pony trap towards Bywater with a face that would have curdled new milk." "She had already nearly curdled me. Honestly, I nearly tried on Bilbo's ring. I longed to disappear." "Don't do that," said Gandalf, sitting down. "Do be careful of that ring, Frodo. In fact, it is partly about that I have come to say a last word." "Well, what about it?" "What do you know already?" "Only what Bilbo told me. I have heard his story, how he found it, and how he used it. On his journey, I mean." "Which story, I wonder?" said Gandalf. "Oh, not what he told the dwarfs and put in his book," said Frodo. "He told me the true story soon after I came to live here. He said you had pestered him till he told you, so I had better know too. No secrets between us, Frodo," he said, "but they are not going to go any further. It's mine anyway." That's interesting, said Gandalf. Well, what do you think of it all? If you mean inventing all that about a present, well, I thought the true story much more likely, and I couldn't see the point of altering it at all. It's very unlike Bilbo to do so, anyway, and I thought it rather odd. So did I, but odd things may happen to people who have such treasures, if they use them. Let it be a warning to you to be very careful with it. It may have other powers that just making you vanish when you wish to. I don't understand, said Frodo. Neither do I, answered the wizard. I have merely begun to wonder about the ring, especially since last night. No need to worry, but if you take my advice, you will use it very seldom, or not at all. At least I beg you not to use it in any way that will cause talk or rouse suspicion. I say again, keep it safe and keep it secret. You are very mysterious. What are you afraid of? I'm not certain, so I will say no more. I may be able to tell you something when I come back. I am going off at once, so this is goodbye for the present. He got up. At once, cried Frodo. Why, I thought you were staying on for at least a week. I was looking forward to your help. I did mean to, but I've had to change my mind. I may be away for a good while, but I'll come and see you again as soon as I can. Expect me when you see me. I shall slip in quietly. I shan't often be visiting the Shire openly again. I find that I have become rather unpopular. They say I am a nuisance and a disturber of the peace. Some people are actually accusing me of spiriting Bilbo away, or worse. If you want to know, there is supposed to be a plot between you and me to get hold of his wealth. Some people, cried Frodo. You mean Othel and Lobelia? How abominable! I would give them Bag End and everything else if I could get Bilbo back and go off tramping in the country with him. I love the Shire, but I begin to wish somehow that I had gone too. I wonder if I shall ever see him again. So do I, said Gandalf, and I wonder many other things. Goodbye now. Take care of yourself. Look out for me, especially at unlikely times. Goodbye. Frodo saw him to the door. He gave a final wave of his hand and walked off at a surprising pace, but Frodo thought the old wizard looked unusually bent, almost as if he was carrying a great weight. The evening was closing in, and his cloaked figure quickly vanished into the twilight. Frodo did not see him again for a long time. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Past. The talk did not die down in 9 or even 99 days. The second disappearance of Mr. Bilbo Baggins was discussed in Hobbiton, and indeed all over the Shire, for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits, and eventually Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend and lived on long after all the true events were forgotten. But in the meantime, the general opinion in the neighborhood was that Bilbo, who had always been rather cracked, had at last gone quite mad and had run off into the blue. There he had undoubtedly fallen into a pool or a river and come to a tragic but hardly an untimely end. The blame was mostly laid on Gandalf. If only that dratted wizard will leave young Frodo alone, perhaps he'll settle down and grow some hobbit sense, they said. And to all appearance, the wizard did leave Frodo alone, and he did settle down. But the growth of hobbit sense was not very noticeable. Indeed, he at once began to carry on Bilbo's reputation for oddity. He refused to go into mourning, and the next year he gave a party in honor of Bilbo's 112th birthday, which he called 100-Weight Feast. But that was short of the mark, for 20 guests were invited, and there were several meals at which it snowed food and rained drink, as hobbits say. Some people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up the custom of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year until they got used to it. He said that he did not think Bilbo was dead. When they asked, "Where is he then?" he shrugged his shoulders. He lived alone, as Bilbo had done, but he had a good many friends, especially among the younger hobbits, mostly descendants of the old Took, who had, as children, been fond of Bilbo and often in and out of Bag End. Folko Boffin and Fredegar Bolger were two of these, but his closest friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybuck. His real name was Meriadoc, but that was seldom remembered. Frodo went tramping all over the Shire with them, but more often he wandered by himself, and to the amazement of sensible folks, he was sometimes seen far from home walking in the hills and woods under the starlight. Merry and Pippin suspected that he visited the elves at times, as Bilbo had done. As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit just out of his tweens. Some folks have all the luck, they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usually more sober age of 50 that they began to think it queer. Frodo himself, after the first shock, found that being his own master and the Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years he was quite happy and did not worry much about the future. But half unknown to himself, the regret that he had not gone with Bilbo was steadily growing. He found himself wondering at times, especially in the autumn, about the wild lands and strange visions of mountains that he had never seen came into his dreams. He began to say to himself, perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day, to which the other half of his mind always replied, not yet. So it went on until his 40s were running out and his 50th birthday was drawing near. 50 was a number that he felt was somehow significant or ominous. It was at any rate at that age that adventure had suddenly befallen Bilbo. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old paths seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield and more often by himself, and Merry and his other friends watched him anxiously. Often he was seen walking and talking with the strange wayfarers that began at this time to appear in the Shire. There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at that time appeared or sent any message for several years, Frodo gathered all the news he could. Elves, who seldom walked in the Shire, could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing and not returning. But they were leaving Middle-earth and were no longer concerned with its troubles. There were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens, and dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts, if they wanted any. As a rule, dwarfs said little, and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarfs of far countries seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy and of the land of Mordor. That name the hobbits only knew in legends of the dark past, like a shadow in the background of their memories. But it was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that the evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to reappear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said. From there the power was spreading far and wide, and away far east and south there were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. Little of all this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits, but even the deafest and most stay-at-home began to hear queer tales, and those whose business took them to the borders saw strange things. The conversation in the Green Dragon at Bywater one evening in the spring of Frodo's 50th year showed that even in the comfortable heart of the Shire rumors had been heard, though most hobbits still laughed at them. Sam Gamgee was sitting in one corner near the fire, and opposite him was Ted Sandyman, the miller's son, and there were various other rustic hobbits listening to their talk. "Queer things you do hear these days, to be sure," said Sam. "Ah," said Ted, "you do if you listen. but I can hear fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to." "No doubt you can," retorted Sam, "and I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who invented the stories, anyway? Take dragons, now." "No, thanky," said Ted. "I won't. I've heard tell of them when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in them now." "There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's green," he said, getting a general laugh. "All right," said Sam, laughing with the rest. "But what about these tree men, these giants, as you might call them? They do say that one bigger than a tree was seen up way beyond the North Moors not long back." "Who's they?" "My cousin Hal, for one. He works for Mr. Boffin at Overhill and goes up to the North Faring for the hunting. He saw one." "Says he did, perhaps. Your Hal's always saying he's seen things, and maybe he sees things that ain't there." "But this one was as big as an elm tree and walking 7 yards to a stride if it was an inch." "Then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree, as like as not. But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on the North Moors." "Then Hal can't have seen one," said Ted. There was some laughing and clapping. The audience seemed to think that Ted had scored a point. "All the same," said Sam, "you can't deny that others besides our half-caste have seen queer folk around the Shire. Crossing it, mind you. There are more that are turned back at the borders. The boundary have never been so busy before." "And I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say they are going to the harbours, out away beyond the White Towers." Sam waved his arm vaguely. Neither he nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers beyond the western borders of the Shire. But it was an old tradition that away over there stood the Grey Havens, from which at times elven ships set sail, never to return. "They are sailing, sailing, sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us," said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly. But Ted laughed. "Well, that isn't anything new, if you believe the old tales, and I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail. But I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire." "Well, I don't know," said Sam thoughtfully. He believed he had once seen an elf in the woods, and still hoped to see more one day. Of all the legends that he had heard in his early years, such fragments of tales of half-remembered stories about the elves as the hobbits knew had always moved him most deeply. "There are some, even in these parts, as know the fair folk and get news of them," he said. "There's Mr. Baggins, now, that I work for. He told me that they were sailing, and he knows a bit about elves. And old Mr. Bilbo knew more. Many's the talk I had with him when I was a little lad." "Oh, they're both cracked," said Ted. "Leastways old Bilbo was cracked, and Frodo's cracking. If that's where you get your news from, you'll never want for moonshine. Well, friends, I'm off home. Your good health." He drained his mug and went out noisily. Sam sat silent and said no more. He had a good deal to think about. For one thing, there was a lot to do up in the Bag End garden, and he would have a busy day tomorrow, if the weather cleared. The grass was growing fast, but Sam had more on his mind than gardening. After a while he sighed and got up and went out. It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quietly fading into night. He walked home under the early stars through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party he had been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit, and after taking a good look at him, he went off again. During the next year or two he had turned up fairly often, coming unexpectedly after dusk and going off without warning before sunrise. He would not discuss his own business and journeys, and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then suddenly his visits had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. Frodo welcomed his old friend with surprise and great delight. They looked hard at one another. "Ah, well, eh?" said Gandalf. "You look the same as ever, Frodo." "And so do you," Frodo replied, but secretly he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn. He pressed him for news of himself and of the wide world, and soon they were deep in talk, and they stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after a late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of the study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm, and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the trees' fingers. Gandalf was thinking of a spring nearly 80 years before, when Bilbo had run at a bag end without a handkerchief. His hair was perhaps whiter than it had been then, and his beard and eyebrows were perhaps longer, and his face more lined with care and wisdom, but his eyes were as bright as ever, and he smoked and blew smoke rings with the same vigor and delight. He was smoking now in silence, for Frodo was sitting still, deep in thought. Even in the light of morning he felt the dark shadow of the tidings that Gandalf had brought. At last he broke the silence. "Last night you began to tell me strange things about my ring, Gandalf," he said. "And then you stopped, because you said that such matters were best left until daylight. Don't you think you had better finish now? You say the ring is dangerous, far more dangerous than I guess. In what way?" "In many ways," answered the wizard. "It is far more powerful than I ever dared to think at first. So powerful that in the end it would utterly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess him. In Eregion long ago, many elven rings were made, magic rings as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and the elven smiths were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. A mortal, Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes, in the end, invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later the dark power will devour him." "How terrifying," said Frodo. There was another long silence. The sound of Sam Gamgee cutting the lawn came in from the garden. "How long have you known this?" asked Frodo at length. "And how much did Bilbo know?" "Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I am sure," said Gandalf. "He would certainly never have passed on to you anything that he thought would be a danger, even though I promised to look after you. He thought the ring was very beautiful and very useful at need, and if anything was wrong or queer, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and he was always worrying about it, but he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. Though he had found out that the ring needed looking after, it did not seem always of the same size or length. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight. Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter," said Frodo, "so I have always kept it on its chain." "Very wise," said Gandalf. "But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit for that to himself, and he was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy. Thin and stretched, he said, a sign that the ring was getting control." "How long have you known all this?" asked Frodo again. "Known?" said Gandalf. "I have known much that only the wise know, Frodo. But if you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There is the last test to make, but I no longer doubt my guess." "When did I first begin to guess?" he mused, searching back in memory. "Let me see. It was in the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of 5 Armies. that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by the great ring as plainly as it was. That at least was clear from the first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When I at last got the truth out of him, I saw at once that he had been trying to put its claim to the ring beyond doubt. Much like Gollum with his birthday present. The lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it and soon got angry. There was little else that I could do. I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Samaran the White, but something always held me back. "Who is he?" asked Frodo. "I have never heard of him before." "Maybe not," answered Gandalf. "Hobbits are, or were, no concern of his. Yet he is great among the wise. He is the chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill of any meddling. The lore of the elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost letters of their making, but when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told against my fear. So my doubt slept but uneasily. Still I watched and waited. All seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again, but I said to myself, after all, he comes from a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet. Wait. And I waited, until that night when he left his house. He said and did things that have filled me with fear no words of Samaran could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of the years since then in finding out the truth of it. There wasn't any permanent harm done, was there? Asked Frodo anxiously. He would get all right in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean? He felt better at once, said Gandalf. But there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, and as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about hobbits. Among the wise, I am the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter they can be, and yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it likely that some would resist the rings far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need worry about Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years and used it, so it might take a long while for the influence to wear off, before it was safe for him to see it again, for instance. Otherwise, he might live on for years, quite happily, just stop as he was when he parted with it. For he gave it up in the end, of his own accord. An important point. No, I was not troubled about dear Bilbo any more, once he had let the thing go. It is for you that I feel responsible. Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you, and about all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the dark power overcame the Shire, if all your kind, jolly, stupid bolgers, hornblowers, boffins, brace girdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginses, became enslaved. Frodo shuddered. But why would we be, he asked, and why should he want such slaves? To tell you the truth, replied Gandalf, I believe that hitherto, mark you, he has entirely overlooked the existence of hobbits. You should be thankful. But your safety has passed. He does not need you. He has many more useful servants, but he won't forget you again. And hobbits, as miserable slaves, would please him far more than hobbits happy and free. There is such a thing as malice and revenge. Revenge, said Frodo. Revenge for what? I still don't understand what all this has to do with Bilbo and myself and our ring. It has everything to do with it, said Gandalf. You do not know the real peril yet, but you shall. I was not sure of it myself when I was last here, but the time has come to speak. Give me the ring for a moment. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if either it or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked. No, said Frodo. There were none. It was quite plain, and it never shows a scratch or sign of wear. Well then, look. To Frodo's astonishment and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly into the middle of the glowing corner of the fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. Wait, he said in a commanding voice, giving Frodo a quick look from under his bristling brows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up, closed the shutters outside the window, and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sam's shears, now nearer to the window, could still be heard visibly in the garden. For a moment the wizard stood looking at the fire. Then he stooped and removed the ring to the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo gasped. It is quite cool, said Gandalf. Take it. Frodo picked it up on his shrinking palm. It seemed to have become thicker and heavier than ever. Hold it up, said Gandalf, and look closely. As Frodo did so, he now saw the fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring, outside in lines of fire that seemed to form the letters of a flowing script. They shone piercingly bright and yet remote, as if out of a great depth. I cannot read the fiery letters, said Frodo in a quavering voice. No, said Gandalf, but I can. The letters are Elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this, in the common tongue, is what it said, close enough. One ring to rule them, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. He paused, and then said slowly in a deep voice, This is the master ring, the one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago, to the great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it. Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand, like a dark cloud rising in the east, and looming up to engulf him. This ring, he stammered. How on earth did it come to me? Ah, said Gandalf, that is a very long story. The beginnings lie back in the black years, which only the lore masters now remember. If I were to tell you that tale, we should still be sitting here when spring had passed into winter. But last night I told you of Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord. The rumors that you have heard are true. He is indeed arisen again, and left his hold in Mirkwood, and returned to his ancient fastness in the Dark Tower of Mordor. The name even you hobbits have heard of, like a shadow on the borders of old stories. Always after a defeat and a respite, the shadows take another shape and move again. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We shall be hard put to it. We should be very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks one thing to give him strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, break the last defenses, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. The three, fairest of all, the elf lords hid from him, and his hand never touched them or sullied them. 7 the dwarf kings possessed, but 3 he has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. 9 he gave to mortal men, proud and great, and so ensnared them. Long ago they fell under the dominion of the One, and they became ring-wraiths, shadows under his great shadow, his most terrible servants. Long ago. It is many a year since the 9 walked abroad. Yet who knows, as the shadow grows once more, they too may walk again. But come, we will not speak of such things even in the morning of the Shire. Good night, baby. I love you. I think I am probably gonna end it here as well, because I can feel myself falling asleep as I'm reading. And that's not going to do anyone any good if I read myself to sleep. So I will take my little sticky note and mark where I am leaving off. And I shall scoop myself off to bed and hope that it isn't another 4 months before I have 2 days off and I can stream again. Thank you all for joining. I do wish that I could say I will be streaming again soon. But that just isn't how things seem to be working out. But I will definitely try now that I've pieced my microphone stand back together. 2020 has sucked. It has really, really sucked. But I am determined not to end it without streaming again, so I'm glad you were able to stop by too. I have missed reading, and it was actually more enjoyable reading from an actual book and not trying to read words on a screen. I hope that you all have a lovely day, evening, sleep, wherever it is that you are headed off to. And let me see if there is anyone. What am I trying to get to? There we go. Let's see who is online that we want to go and visit. Anna with Sand Art is on. She is streaming. So we will go and visit her. It's been a very long time since I got to do a raid. So everybody go and hang out with Anna. Thank you again for all stopping by. Love you all. Take care.